Fancy. This is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I am wearing a witch hat today because it is Top 5 Wednesday and today's topic is witches. Top 5 Wednesday is a Goodreads group originally created by Lainey from Ginger Reads Lainey, currently moderated by Sam from Thoughts on Tomes. I'll leave the link below so you can check it out. Every week there's a new topic and you can choose your top 5 books for that topic and post your list on whatever your book recommending platform is. October's topics are all kind of Halloween themed, and witches is the one that I care about, I think, most deeply because I read a whole lot of fantasy books with witches in them. Now, I read a whole lot of books with magical women in them to begin with, but you don't necessarily assign the term witch to all of those characters. The idea of witches and witchcraft has such a long, fraught history, and the term itself is weighted with so many cultural ideas of what that means. And fantasy authors can use that term to apply to magical characters, specifically magical women most of the time, in a whole variety of different narrative contexts, but the term itself carries a lot of implications and weight, so I put this list together to sort of highlight some books that use the idea of witches and witchcraft in some interesting ways. Because in a historical context or in a fantasy context, whether they are respected for their abilities or reviled, whether they are trusted or feared, whether they are cartoonish Halloween decorations made to frighten the kiddos, whether they are figures in your favorite fairy tales, a witch is a woman with power, and how an author chooses to write about that I think can be very revealing. So the first book I'm actually going to talk about here is one that I am currently reading for the Cozy-a-thon. I am about halfway through, but I figured I needed to mention it because in many ways I feel like this is a really quintessential witch story, and this is Of Sorrow and Such by Angela Slater. It's one of the Tor.com novellas. This is about a woman named Mistress Gideon who is an herbalist and a healer in a town called Edda's Meadow. She is also a witch, and she has both magical abilities and a dark past. So far, the focus of this story is the fear that she constantly lives in of being discovered, of having her witchcraft discovered. She knows that as a healer she will never have the respect in the community that a male doctor would, but if it were discovered that she's a witch, she would be killed. And so she can't afford to trust too many people who might behave unwisely and intentionally or inadvertently reveal her secrets. Mistress Gideon has a foster daughter named Jilly, whom she has raised as her own, but while Jilly is a talented apprentice herbalist, she doesn't have any magic of her own, and she is resentful towards Mistress Gideon for not teaching her witchcraft. And I'm going to read you the quote that the title of the book comes from, where this is Mistress Gideon talking to her adoptive daughter, and she says, "My girl, my darling girl, don't wish for what I've got. A witch's life is made of sorrow and such. Be happy you've a chance at something else." So as I've said, I've not yet finished reading this book. I will obviously be including it in my October wrap-up, so you'll hear my full thoughts on the story at that time. Another book that deals with the really sexist persecution of people perceived or suspected to be witches, but in a historical context, is Bitter Greens by Kate Forsyth. This is a book about the history of the Rapunzel fairy tale, and it has multiple plot lines. The main plot line takes place in 17th century France, and one of the things that happened during the reign of Louis XIV is something called the Affair of the Poisons, where members of the French aristocracy were accused of witchcraft and of consulting with witches for poisons and charms and such. It was an enormous scandal. It is fascinating history, and it's also kind of terrifying to read about. So that's one of the things that happens in one of the storylines of this book. There are two other storylines that take place earlier in, I think, 16th century Italy. One of them is an actual version of the Rapunzel story that includes an actual magical witch. And then the third is the story of that actual magical witch. And all three storylines deal with some really horrific situations that are forced upon women. So if you're looking for something on the literary historical side of things that has to do with witches, I would recommend this. It's also a great book for fairy tale enthusiasts and people interested in witches in a fairy tale sense. Another book I might recommend for fans of fairy tale witches is The King of Elfland's Daughter by Lord Dunsany. Now, the witch in this is definitely a secondary character, but one of the things that I think is fascinating about her is that she is neither a good witch nor an evil witch. She is just a witch. Also, her name is Zerundarel, which is incredible. I think of her as a witch sort of in a fairy tale sense because she's a character that other characters in the story come to seeking advice or help with regards to magical dilemmas. After forging a magical sword for Alvaric's quest into Elfland to marry the King of Elfland's daughter Lyrazel, she becomes the nurse to their half-elven, half-human son. But although Lord Dunsany hints that she's a character who has a really interesting history and incredible abilities, we sort of specifically only see a small portion of that, and she remains kind of a mystery. Reading this book, I was wondering, like, what is a witch in this story? What sort of abilities does she have, and why? What has she seen? What has she done? And it's implied that there's a whole lot of that you just don't get to learn. It sort of felt to me like reading Lord of the Rings and being like, but what is a wizard? So I'd say the witchcraft in this was sort of open to interpretation in a way that sort of sparked my imagination. The next book is on this list I think purely because of a quote in it that I keep seeing referenced ever since I read the book, and this is In the Night Garden by Catherynne and Valente. This is the first book in the Orphan's Tales, which follow a stories within stories structure. So obviously there are a whole lot of magical creatures and so forth in these books. One of the earliest stories in this book, though, is the story of a witch. And the quote that I keep seeing referenced is, "Never put your faith in a prince. When you require a miracle, trust a witch." I think taken as a whole, all of the stories in these books take the downtrodden and villainized characters and creatures from fairy tale and mythology traditions and put them front and center. You get, like, everyone's perspectives in these books, and it's great. But in terms of witches actually being heroes of fantasy novels, my first and foremost recommendation, leaving the best for last, will always have to be the witches of Terry Pratchett's Discworld. I'm actually cheating a little bit and using two different books for this #1 slot because these are the two places I would recommend starting if you wanted to read about Pratchett's witches. Wyrd Sisters is not technically the first of the witches subseries of novels. That would be Equal Rights, but all of the books in the witches subseries except for Equal Rights belong to sort of a long-reaching story arc that starts with Wyrd Sisters, and Equal Rights doesn't really belong in that story arc, and I don't think it's as good as the later books. This was the first of Pratchett's adult books that I ever read. It focuses on a coven of 3 witches, and it spoofs both Macbeth, the play that famously has witches in it, and also Hamlet. The wizards in Pratchett's Discworld are bumbling and ineffectual. The witches, on the other hand, are practical and down-to-earth, and they get things done. Granny Weatherwax is the heart and soul of these books. I think of her as, like, the only truly formidable character in all of the Discworld books that I've read so far. But where I actually started reading about these characters was in the Tiffany Aching books. This is The We Free Men. These are books for younger readers. They take place chronologically, I think, after the events of the main Adult Witches series, but obviously you can read them first as they are intended for younger readers. I started reading these as a kid, and the reason that when I started reading adult Discworld, I jumped in with Wyrd Sisters is because these have crossover characters. These are about a young witch named Tiffany Aching who over the course of the series becomes Granny Weatherwax's protege. And she's just one of the best middle grade fantasy heroines I have ever read. She comes from a rural sheep herding family. In this first book, she talks about the fact that there was a woman who was ostracized by the community, who was killed for being a witch. But Tiffany is pretty sure that she wasn't actually a witch. She was just a lady who lived all alone. On the other hand, Tiffany is fairly certain that her grandmother, Granny Aching, was a witch, even though she didn't go by that name. Granny Aching was the heart and soul of the community. And in this book, Tiffany uses the memory of her grandmother's wisdom in order to come into her own as a witch of sorts herself. And what Tiffany begins to understand is that being a true witch isn't necessarily about doing magic, but it's about perceiving things clearly. So that's Terry Pratchett's Witches in a nutshell, basically. Women with their heads screwed on, doing the right thing. So that's my top 5 Wednesday of books with witches in them. I hope I've given you enough variety to give you some things to chew on. So how about you? If you read fantasy, what sort of stories about witches appeal to you and why? Anyhow, happy October. I hope you're having a nice day. That is all. Bye for now.